around and started talking. Got some Billy would take me walking. Out through the backyard we go walking. Then he looked.
Good evening, and welcome to Doctorpiece Theater. My name is Dr. Dennis Business, and tonight we continue our dive into Stones to Abbigale. I don't remember where we were. Chapter 13. Christmas was closing in on us, so Abby found herself often talking about her excitement for what gifts she was going to get me. I was just happy that I would be spending the holiday with her exclusively, as my mom had already moved out and planned to spend the holidays with Rick up on the ski slopes. It was our last day of school before winter break, which pretty much guaranteed us freezing as we waited for the bus. To my surprise, Davis welcomed us both as we climbed on. He shouted, "If it isn't Mr. and Mrs. Santa Claus, here to bring joy and love to everyone." We both smiled, and I could see Abby was quickly becoming just as enchanted by Davis as I was. Abby sat down with me to only quickly huddle next to me for warmth. "Did you slip on the ice on the way over, Mr. Claus?" Davis asked. I replied, "No ho ho," and grinned. He said, "But no, really, I'm surprised they didn't cancel school. It's kind of super crazy out." The bus driver screamed, "Sorry about the lack of heat. They gave me a pretty crappy bus. They said I couldn't handle the other buses or some junk like that." Davis leapt up, shouting back, "We love you, Mr. Bus Driver. You saved our lives." The driver then asked, "Oh yeah? What's my name?" Davis replied almost instantly, "Well, what's my name?" The bus driver responded, "I asked first." Davis said that again. "Well, I'll just call you Superhero for now." The bus driver laughed as Davis sat back down giggling. As the bus pulled up to our school, we could see the early stages of what would be heavy construction. I asked the bus driver what was going on, and he replied, "Well, ever since that shooting, you guys have become quite the symbol of hope for the country. Pretty sure the president has a hand in paying all these workers double what they'd usually make to get all these renovations done by the time winter break is over." As we stepped onto the cement walkway just outside the bus, we could hear large chunks of salt crumbling under our feet. Davis busted out with more antics. "Whoa, this salt is sheer slippery," he said as he stumbled around like a drunken uncle on ice. Abby and I said goodbye to Davis as he did another goofy impression while we walked away. I hugged Abby and kissed her before we also parted ways. As I turned away, she slipped a note into my pocket. I turned and said with a smile, "Really?" She responded, "I know, but I wrote it while you slept last night, so what you gonna do?" Walking off to class, I reflected on the lingering feeling I had, like I was living a life that was too good for me. It was as if everything I had worked out despite me having an underlying sensation that I had yet to earn my happiness. But I suppose that comes with the constant self-inflicted reminder of how small I am in the world. To me, love was really the only thing that kept me going. I felt like someone who had swam too far into the ocean, but somehow found a piece of driftwood to cling to. For me, that one piece of wood wasn't just some random object in the ocean. It was my life. This simple piece of wood represented my capacity to love and my only hope of staying alive. Abby didn't just give me hope, but also a promise that so long as I had her, I would never slip back into the numb existence I was living in before. I sat in Washington State history class and tried to open the note Abby wrote me, but Mr. Hanson immediately gave me a dirty look. He then lurched up out of his seat, wiped his forehead, and walked over, putting his hand out to receive the note. "You know there's no note reading in this class. Give it to me, James," he said, without any sign of compassion. Mr. Hanson was mostly a nice guy, but he rarely joked around with class rules. I thought he wouldn't be as hard on me, as I was his teacher's assistant next period, but I was clearly wrong. I had to think fast, so I replied, saying, "Sorry, I have to go to the bathroom." I stood up quickly and walked out of the class as Mr. Hanson blurted out, "I said, give me that note, James!" Ignoring his command, I pushed my way into the restroom, down the hall, and locked myself in a stall. I opened the note to find the following. "James, I'm laying here next to you, ironically watching you sleep despite my previous jokes about you doing the same. I want to talk to you so badly right now, but I don't want to wake you, especially not with what I have to say. I keep telling you that I don't want anything to be hidden between us, James, and I mean that. You haven't asked me about what I initially spoke to you about behind the church regarding the letter you wrote me. I told you about friends that have taken advantage of me, and later I showed you my many scars. But I haven't told you everything, James. You should hear everything. You deserve to know everything. Miss Robertson was supportive of me when I came to her about being raped. She even helped me make sure the boys responsible saw their day in court and were expelled from this school. I'm having a really hard time writing this, but James, as a result of what those boys did, I became pregnant. I told Miss Robertson and found out right after that she is extremely pro-life, and I mean extremely. So I told her I didn't want to give them the satisfaction of bringing their child into this world. But she kept saying I shouldn't punish another person for the actions of their biological father. I was dating Seth at the time. I didn't tell Seth who had raped me because I knew he was psychotic, but I still cared about him, and I didn't want him to throw his life away by doing something he couldn't take back. Obviously, I couldn't change the path he was going down. He saw my behavior change as the pregnancy progressed. After a while of seeing the state I was in, he asked me to admit to him what he suspected. I refused to tell him anything and told him to leave it alone, so he threw me against the wall and demanded I admitted what I was hiding. Once I confessed I was pregnant, he, without hesitation, punched me repeatedly in the stomach. I was sobbing, and he just kept yelling at me, telling me everything was my fault. Despite me trying to protect my stomach, he would just pull my hands away so he could punch me again and again. My father walked in on Seth yelling at me, and he demanded Seth leave, but Seth refused. I screamed at Seth that we were over from the floor where I was laying. I kept telling him that it was over. With every breath I could manage, I made sure he knew I didn't want to see him again. It was the only power I had, and I used it to fight back. My father was threatening Seth, saying he was going to get his gun, but Seth just kept screaming about how he was being punished for saving my life as he saw it. So my father grabbed him and physically forced him to leave. My father drove me to the hospital. I suppose the only time he can act like a good guy is when there's an even worse person around. They gave me pain medication, and not too long after, it became clear to me that I was no longer pregnant. I felt like everything was my fault. Shortly after this happened, I started cutting myself. I hated myself more than anyone. Every time I looked in the mirror, I saw someone who was broken, damaged beyond repair. I had to stop reading for a moment to collect myself. Tears were falling down my face. I imagined her eyes vividly in my mind. The ocean wall of tears I had seen behind her eyes and the sadness I felt from her was being laid out right in front of me. She wrote about her life falling apart, and the more she explained, the more everything seemed to come together. And nope. That's allergies. That's not emotion, that's allergies. I continued reading. I went to Miss Robertson with all this information, and she turned her back on me completely. She was convinced that I got Seth to punch me so I would lose the baby, and she was clearly holding me responsible for a life that I couldn't. She could barely even look at me. My father treated me different after it all happened as well. He too acted like I was at fault for how things wound up. Just like Miss Robertson, despite me never asking for any of it. I have no idea if I would have gone through with the pregnancy. I felt like I was willing to adopt them out once they were born, but Seth didn't ask me what I wanted. James, I'm not sure at this point you may be wondering why I was with Seth when we started talking. The pregnancy was over for a year before I even talked to you. So obviously, I got back together with him. It's really hard to explain, but I'll do my best. The reality is, I had no one left, James. I couldn't talk to Miss Robertson about my cutting or depression. I couldn't talk to my dad. All I had was Seth, who didn't even have to ask for me to take him back. I freely went to him because he was the only person who was even willing to talk to me. I felt like no one else felt I was worth anything. Despite him making me feel horrible both emotionally and physically, he at least acknowledged my existence, beyond the few words I could get from anyone else. After everything, I felt like he was all I deserved. That's when I noticed you, James, staring at me in class. I didn't think you would ever give me a chance once you discovered me, but you did, James. You pulled me away from the horrible life I found myself living in and made me feel happier than I even knew possible. My life before you seems more and more long and a painful nightmare. It was a nightmare that I don't have to worry about slipping into anymore. I trust you, James. Please. I can't. I'm sorry. I dropped the note, staring only for a minute at it in my lap. The more I read, the more I wanted to hold her. I just wanted to be there to take her away before any of these things could have ever happened. Without a second thought, I crammed the note into my pocket and began walking quickly towards Abby's first period class. Approaching her class door, I aggressively pulled it open and walked across the room towards Abby. Her teacher screamed, "Excuse me, son!" And one of the students yelled out, "Oh God, not again!" I ignored both of them by grabbing Abby by the center of their back and her leg lifting up to wrap her legs around me. She said, her voice shaking, "James?" I sat her on her desk and pulled her neck towards me, kissing her deeply and passionately, ignoring everything but her. "Unacceptable!" The teacher screamed angrily as the class erupted with, "Ooh," just like I had heard in the earlier fistfights. It was the first time I felt anything positive from hearing that sound. I continued to deeply kiss Abby, sticking my tongue in her mouth. She sucked on my tongue, matching my passion. She bit my lip, and I bit hers. We were disgusting and beautiful together in the same instance, showing no shame for our raw passion. The teacher nearly lost it as they screamed, "Are you looking to get suspended? This is a classroom!" I pulled slightly back from Abby and asked, "Through everything?" She replied with a huge smile on her face, "Absolutely everything." I then grabbed her again by the back of her leg and the middle of her back to sit her down again. I turned to the door and walked out. I could hear the class continue to react in an uproar over what they had just witnessed as I walked away. Off in the distance behind me, I could hear the teacher screaming outside their classroom, "Is anyone going to do anything about this?" But she was the only staff member around. Class was still in session. Walking back into Mr. Hansen's class, I was greeted by a bitter and sarcastic tone. "Did you have a good squat, James?" I ignored him, grinning as I returned to my seat. Despite the teacher's assistant period after, Mr. Hansen got a phone call and looked immediately in my direction. "James made out with a girl in her class?" he said. Mr. Hansen stared at me and continued, "Well, he was going to the bathroom." He looked up at me, and while covering up the phone, he said in a loud, whispery tone, "What exactly did she write you?" Before I gave any response, he looked back. He looked back as if listening to the phone and said to them, "Never mind. Anyway, long story short, I think this place could benefit from a little distraction, don't you?" The voice on the phone sounded outraged, so he continued, "Well, you may as well just call winter break his suspension, 'cause it's the last day anyway." The person on the other end went silent and hung up. Mr. Hansen looked at me and said, "You really are something strange, kid." I smiled, having just seen a glimmer of the real human being inside Mr. Hansen for the first time that day, and replied, "Thanks for sticking up for me." He then said, "Consider us even." I smiled and returned to grading the papers I was assigned, and he added, "Let's just hope I don't get beat up after class for that like you did, though." I laughed, and he chuckled to himself. That was chapter 13 of Stones to Abbigale. I have so much to say, but it's going to have to wait for another time. This has been Doctorpiece Theater, and my name is Dr. Dennis Business. And as always, my friends,